Urgent question, Tobias Ellwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Foreign Minister to make a statement on US troop withdrawal from North Syria?
The Minister of State, Dr. Andrew Muse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his urgent question. We are consulting with the US on the response to proposed Turkish military action in north-east Syria. The Foreign and Defence Secretaries both spoke to their US counterparts yesterday. The US position, including any movement of US troops, is of course a matter for the US government. However, the US Department of Defence said in a statement yesterday that the US does not endorse a Turkish operation in north-east Syria. We have been consistently clear with Turkey that unilateral military action must be avoided, as it would destabilise the region and threaten efforts to secure the lasting defeat of Daesh. As members of the global coalition, our focus remains on securing the enduring defeat of Daesh. We will continue to work with the US and other international partners to that end.
Tobias Ellwood.
Well, I'm grateful to the Foreign Minister. I firstly declare an interest. I am a dual US national. Mr. Speaker, the US is our most trusted and valued ally. We share the same vision and indeed help wanting to shape the world around us, defend its international standards and values. It's why we stepped forward in the first place to form the international coalition to defeat Daesh that the Minister just made reference to. That bond, that friendship, that trust means that we have a privileged relationship with the US that enables us to be honest and speak out if there are differences of opinion. And today is one such case. The President's decision to remove US troops from northern Syria goes against official and congressional advice and will leave the Syrian Democratic Forces exposed to the expected Turkish offensive to establish a 30-kilometre safe zone in northern Syria. These are the same Kurdish forces who worked with us to defeat Daesh. Essentially, they were our boots on the ground. And now it seems we're turning our backs on them. If this goes ahead, it will be no orderly handover. The Kurds will fight to defend their land. And if this zone is secured, Turkey then intends to move over 3 million refugees that are currently in Turkey into this zone, fundamentally altering the ethnic makeup of the region. Mr. Speaker, if anything is to be learned from previous interventions, you don't abandon the very people you step forward to help before the job is done. General Petraeus said it's no longer good enough to defeat the enemy, you have to enable the local. We need to learn from Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan, Charlie Wilson's war, and after 9/11, as well as Libya. You create a vacuum, it's quickly filled by stakeholders who pursue a very different agenda. So could I ask the Minister, further to his conversations, or the Secretary of State's conversations, will the Prime Minister be speaking to the President on this matter? And have he spoken, or indeed the Foreign Secretary spoken, to our coalition allies on this fundamental change in US foreign policy? He says US troops is a matter, or placement of US troops is a matter for that country, but they are part of an international coalition. We will only defeat the challenges around the world if we work and stick together. So can I ask also, Mr. Speaker, what impact will this decision have on our efforts, our DFID efforts, to help provide aid to this country, this war-torn country? And he talks about preventing Turkey or discouraging Turkey from crossing the border in some form of invasion, creating that safe zone. What actions does he think the international community, or indeed Britain, will take if such an action does in fact take place? And more generally, Mr. Speaker, does he acknowledge that the character of conflict has changed? These are not soldiers in uniform, but radicalised extremists that are committed to pursuing their jihadist agenda. Many of these fighters come from across Europe, including the UK. Simply denying dual nationals the ability to return to the UK is not enough to keep our nation safe. So does he agree that the international community must design a better long-term legal solution to the challenge which will not go away? Neither the SDF nor Turkey has the desire to properly process the number of detainees and foreign fighters. If Turkey invades, the SDF will fight back and these camps, such as in Al-Hol, will get caught in the middle, with thousands either deliberately released or indeed able to escape. And we will then see the emergence of Daesh 2.0. Mr. Speaker, we must have the strength and the resolve to ask our closest ally to reconsider. Let's also exhibit our own international leadership by energising the same international community that so swiftly came together to defeat Daesh militarily and now needs to stay the course to stabilise the region we helped to liberate. Otherwise, why did we step forward in the first place? Our world is getting more dangerous and the threats more complex. The international community must stick together.
Order. The honourable gentleman speaks with very considerable authority on these matters, and that was part of the rationale for granting him his urgent question. He rather gently pointed out to me that it was his first urgent question, so I granted him some latitude because I think the House wanted to hear from him. But other colleagues can not expect comparable latitude. 2 minutes does not mean 4 minutes. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, nevertheless, the eloquence of my right honourable friend, I think, probably justified the length of time that he took. I'll try to address some of the points that he made. I absolutely agree with him on the point about this being primarily an issue about Daesh, and the concern I would have, to answer his question about foreign fighters and others, is that my worry would be that this will divert SDF from their activities against Daesh in the Euphrates Valley, absolutely 100%. He will understand that we are talking to all of our interlocutors at the moment. This is very kinetic, it's very fast changing, and of course we need to ensure that so far as we can we influence our partners in a way that he has just described. The US withdrawal, as I understand it, if it happens, will be a fairly small scale. It will involve a small number of troops in the immediate vicinity of the border. That's our understanding. We do not support any incursion by Turkey into north-west Syria. He will know from previous outings at the dispatch box of the extent and breadth and depth of DFID support for the crisis in Syria. We are among the top few in terms of our financial contributions to that awful humanitarian disaster. I hope that begins to address some of the points that he raised.
Thank you. Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question, and let me thank the Right Honourable Member for Bournemouth East, along with all those other members who sought to pursue this issue today, including my friend, the member for Brighton Kemp Town. Mr. Speaker, the number of UQ applications you had today reflects the range of concern and indeed anger across this House about the Trump administration's decision to open the door to a Turkish invasion of northern Syria and the subjugation of the Kurdish people in Rojava. The very people who led the fight against Daesh and 11,000 brave fighters in that process. Donald Trump is not just abandoning those Kurdish allies, he is betraying their sacrifice. And of all the great and unmatched ways in which he has shamed his office over the last 3 years, this is one of the very worst. But simple expressions of anger will not help the Kurdish people now. So let me ask the Minister of State 4 specific questions. First, in answer to critics of his decision, Donald Trump said yesterday, and I quote, that many people agree with it very strongly. And specifically, he said, the UK is very thrilled at this decision. Will the Minister of State make it clear today that that is a lie? And can he explain what, if anything, the Foreign Secretary said yesterday to Mike Pompeo that might have given Donald Trump that impression? Second, will the Minister of State agree to table emergency resolutions at this afternoon's UN Security Council meeting and tomorrow's North Atlantic Council meeting, prohibiting Turkey from taking any action on the ground or by air to increase its military incursions into northern Syria, and instead redouble our efforts through those bodies to reach genuine peace settlement and political solution and the negotiated withdrawal of all foreign forces? Third, will he also work through the UN Security Council and the High Commission for Refugees to make clear to Turkey that they must not use the American withdrawal as a green light to forcibly resettle non-Kurdish Syrian refugees in the Rojava region in an effort to change its ethnic composition? And finally, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of State insist, as a matter of urgency, that Kurdish representatives are finally invited to join the Syrian Committee on Constitutional Reform so that they are able to stand up for their own rights? There is an old rule of Middle East conflicts, Mr. Speaker, that one way or another, the Kurds will always get sold out. Donald Trump may be following that rule in the most brutal of fashions, but we must unite today, both here and at the United Nations, and say that this time we will not let it happen.
Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the honourable lady for her questions. In terms of the tweet, no idea where that came from. It certainly isn't based upon the conversation that my right honourable friend had with Secretary Pompeo last night. Let me be quite clear. We would be opposed to any incursion by Turkey into Syria. She refers to what is technically called refoulement, that is proscribed under international law. We would most certainly be against any attempt by any state to engage in social engineering, ethnic cleansing or demographic change. She refers to the Constitutional Committee. She'll be aware that Geir Pedersen led on this at UNGA and that this will be stood up on the 30th of September in Geneva. It will be three-pillared, the pillars being the opposition, the regime and independence. And our position would be that all citizens in Syria should be fully represented. There's only one way we can make progress in Syria, and that is through an inclusive political process.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support my right honourable friend's urgent question. This surely is an issue for us to be, in many senses, bolder and more public about our disagreement. As my right honourable friend will know, in the United States, General Petraeus has made it absolutely clear this is the wrong move. The Republicans themselves in Congress are absolutely opposed to this. So this is not an issue about Trump versus just the usual political sources. It is a real problem that we would abandon a key ally in the destruction of the caliphate and only to then release them to the mercies of Turkey. Can we make it very clear publicly, not just to the Americans, Mr. Speaker, that we disapprove of this, but more importantly to the Turks, that if they do carry out their threat, that we would consider this to be an aggressive act against ourselves as much as we would against the Kurds?
Minister of State.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Well, I have said in plain terms that we would resist any incursion into Syria. And the reason for that is, well, there are many reasons for it, but one of the principal ones in our minds is that it will divert attention against the principal threat to this country in relation to this conflict, which of course is Daesh. And it would divert, potentially, efforts by SDF from their operations along the Euphrates Valley to the northwest of the country. That would not be helpful. It would destabilise the situation, and I think is probably behind a lot of the concern that has been expressed in Washington. We will continue to work with our allies to push that line, that agenda, because it's right, and if we're going to restore any sort of equanimity in Syria, we need to be united in this particular fight.
Stephen Gethins.
Speaker, can I thank the right honourable member for securing this question and for his comments and those of other colleagues as well. The SDF forces have been critical in the defeat of the murderous death cult Daesh. And one of my concerns, Mr. Speaker, is what does this say about our commitment to allies in the future and on UK foreign policy when we're seeking those boots on the ground? President Trump's policy is ill thought out and what one Pentagon official described as a blatant betrayal. Can he also say what does this mean for UK forces who are still on the ground? And comments on reports that SDF were compelled to demolish defensive fortifications, if he's got any information on that. And finally, what discussions is he having with his Turkish counterparts, in particular on the humanitarian impact? We know from Save the Children that thousands of children and other refugees need access to food and medicines. What is he doing to secure that? And is now the time to repatriate the innocent British children who have been stuck in Syria?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. The US has to answer for itself. I can't answer for the US or for President Trump. My understanding is that this involves The honourable lady tempts me, but I'm going to resist. The US, I believe, is talking about 50 individuals, 50 US servicemen that they are seeking to redeploy at the moment. That's my understanding. To my knowledge, I have no information on forts. I can't answer his question, I'm afraid. In terms of boots on the ground, again, we need to be careful. The UK does not have regular boots on the ground in Syria. We don't do that. The point about international development and Turkey, he's right to raise this, and he'll be aware that through the FRIT process, FRIT 1, we have been a major donor to this particular crisis, and we're also considering at the moment what our response to FRIT 2 will mean, particularly in the context of our imminent departure from the European Union.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friends and the right honourable lady spoke for the entire House on the important issue raised in this urgent question. But does the Minister understand that Britain must take responsibility for its own nationals and not use some device to evade that responsibility? Nor must we leave them swilling around in ungoverned space where they can do ill in countries less well governed than this one, but where they are also a danger to the people in this country. Does he understand that we may well be talking about approximately 40 people here, of whom maybe as many as 30 are children? Will he raise this matter immediately with the Foreign Secretary and with his colleagues in the government to see if we can get a change of policy and an urgent resolution of that particular issue?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. He's obviously an expert in these matters. There are two categories of individual, aren't there? There are those who are in detention camps, and there are those in Al-Hol, who are the families of detainees in the main. In terms of justice, it's important, in our view, that justice is served as close to as possible to any alleged crime, and we're taking that forward with those in the region. In terms of minors, of course, it is the government's intent that innocents should be protected at all times. He will appreciate the difficulties that poses in the context of Syria, but we are quite clear that minors need to be handled properly and humanely, and that will be our intent.
Anne Clwyd.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid the Kurds are being stabbed in the back once again, as they have so many times in the past. And we do have a responsibility, and we should stand up to it, and we need to know what is going on day by day. We can't wait for the Queen's speech and all of that. We need to know what is happening today and what the Minister will be doing today, because otherwise the Kurds are going to be left to die, as they have so often in the past.
I understand the right honourable lady's frustration. I really do. I think we have to be clear that we can't act alone. We have to act with our partners. That is the reality. The Kurds are not being stabbed in the back by the United Kingdom. US actions obviously are a matter for the US. I hope in my remarks I have given my understanding of the extent and scope of what is in the President's head, so far as I can, and it seems to me that some of the more exaggerated claims probably have been a little bit overdone, but she's right to say this is highly kinetic and things change from moment to moment, and I rather suspect if things do change further, I'm going to be back in this place before too very long, Mr. Speaker.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will be aware, the Minister will be aware that one of the principles of military action is surprise, but it's normally the enemy you're trying to surprise, not your friends. And here we found ourselves surprised by the actions of our most important ally, and our allies on the ground surprised at the possibility they may find their homes under very serious threat from one of our other more important military allies in Turkey. Will the Minister please assure me that our other allies in the region are being assured that the UK will not make a pattern of being fair weather friends, but will actually commit to our allies seriously and properly?
Yes, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. The only point I would make is in terms of surprise, of course, President Erdogan has threatened this before on a number of occasions, and he has previous in relation to Afrin. So this isn't something that has simply come out of the blue. But I agree with him that we need to ensure that we do everything with our colleagues to understand their thinking in these matters so that we can act in a relatively joined-up way, if that's possible.
Stephen Twigg.
As ever, it's innocent civilians who will suffer the consequences of the humanitarian disaster that will follow this decision. Can I press the Minister to respond to the question from my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary? It really is time today for us to table this at the United Nations Security Council.
Mr. Stay.
Well, I can't give the honourable gentleman that commitment here at the dispatch box, but I think the point has been well made and will be considered electively. What he suggests, I'm sure, has merit, but we will have to examine it fully.
Barry Robinson.
Speaker, there have been ongoing concerns regarding the safety and welfare of Syrian refugees on or near the Turkish border. As this progresses and there is a prospect of a safe zone being set up, how can the Minister guarantee that those people will be safe? And also the fears around forcible repatriation or relocation from Turkey into Syria will be challenged, and I'd like to know what representations are being made on their behalf.
Well, she refers to this process of refoulement, which is the forcible repatriation of refugees. We would strongly oppose such a thing, clearly. In answer to the honourable lady who speaks for the opposition, I make it very clear. We would oppose anything that looks like ethnic cleansing, demographic change. All of those things are absolutely not appropriate. We will resist it. Now, she'll be aware of the effort we put in through the FRIT process with the European Union, which will endure on our departure, in support of Turkey, which has done a good job, I have to say, in supporting refugees on its territory. And we will continue to support Turkey in doing that. It's got a strong tradition of humanitarian assistance, and it has acted well so far as refugees are concerned up to this point, and we want to encourage it in that process.
Lord Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chairman of the APPG for North Eastern Syria, we were in Al-Hol and North Eastern Syria a month ago. I want to disagree with the Minister that I don't think this is just primarily an issue of defeating ISIS. This is also about defending an area that has promoted democracy, gender equality, and has been an ally to us. So will we now suspend security and intelligence information with Turkey so they can't use it against one of our allies? And will we bolster support for the SDF to ensure they have the resources they need? And will we also go to NATO to ensure that Turkey can't invoke Clause 5 if there was a backlash?
Hear, hear. Hey.
I don't think we're into Article 5 territory. What I would say is we do support SDF and the coalition. We continue to do that. The principal intent here is the fight against Daesh. Daesh is a clear and present danger. It threatens us all, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that that fight goes on unaffected by this latest news. It's important that we keep our eye on the ball in that respect. There is a lot of work going on, as he may be aware, along the Euphrates River, the Euphrates Valley, against Daesh. It's important that work continues, and this latest news risks destabilising that in our view.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for raising the question. Mr. Speaker, security depends on stability and consistency, and the manner in which the decision taken by President Trump was described does not help that. And it's a reminder, if any is needed, of the dangers of the United Kingdom pivoting too close to United States foreign policy at a time of inconsistency rather than staying close to European allies. Mr. Speaker, could I ask for further reassurance in relation to the global coalition against Daesh, in which the communications cell is based in the United Kingdom, and it does the vital work of dealing with the ideology? Anything that might give Daesh supporters a sense that the United States is weakening in its commitment against Daesh is something that could be used against them and will materially affect those who are carrying on the vital communications work here. Can you assure me that the United States realises that that coalition work is essential and they remain committed to it no matter what this decision may be?
Well, my right honourable friend's point is well made. I can't give him that assurance because I'm not the US, but I'm sure his point will have been heard by our interlocutors. He refers to our allies within the coalition and elsewhere, and he'll be aware that we are working very closely, probably more closely than we have for some considerable time, with in particular our E3 partners, something of a paradox, some might think, given our imminent departure from the European Union, but it remains true nevertheless. And particularly throughout the region which I have geographic responsibility for, I have been struck by the close working relationship that we have in particular with France and Germany.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout this conflict, Syrian civilians have suffered again and again and again. And further to the question that my friend for West Derby asked just now, can I ask the Minister about what we will do? Will we review all of the government's policies at this crucial point and see if we cannot do a little more to accept some more refugees from the region?
Mr. State.
Yeah, I have said in my remarks that alluded to the support that we are giving the humanitarian situation. I suspect probably in a few minutes' time, when I appear before the International Development Select Committee, I shall be quizzed on this further. I'm proud of the contribution made by the British people. I really am. We are in the top few in relation to our support for the humanitarian situation in Syria. I'm also proud that we will, by 2020, have resettled 20,000 Syrians, including in my own constituency. And I think that's a sign of the generosity and big heart of the British people. I think that's a fair contribution, and it's an indication of the UK punching above its weight in international development terms.
It's been blunt.
Having been in North East Syria just 3 weeks ago with the honourable gentleman for Brighton Kemp Town and my honourable friend for Gravesham, can I say to my honourable friend the Minister that the justice measures that are being taken forward apparently on the ground will come as, at least 3 weeks ago, it would have been news to the leaders in the region that there was actually any engagement on that issue. But more importantly, I'm sure he understands the scale of Kurdish resentment following the operation against Afrin, which he mentioned, and therefore the scale of Kurdish resistance if there is a Turkish incursion. He has just said we would resist any incursion into Syria, and we support the SDF and the coalition. What are we actually going to do to deter Turkey from making this profound mistake of this planned intervention in northeast Syria?
Well, look, Turkey is a major NATO ally. It's a good friend of this country. We have some leverage, I think, with Turkey as a friend and as a partner. He will understand that this is in the diplomatic space at the moment. He is tempting me to make all sorts of contingency preparations, which I'm certainly not going to do at this dispatch box. But clearly this is a dynamic situation, and we have to respond to whatever happens. But our message to Turkey is please don't do this. It's going to deflect attention from what really matters here, which is firstly defeating Daesh and secondly restoring this poor, benighted country to some sort of equanimity.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Kurdish diaspora has a sizeable presence in Scotland, with a community centre at Dunbryden in my constituency, and I know they would wish me to remind the UK Government of the debt we all owe to the Kurds in relation to the defeat of Daesh. So can he confirm that the United Kingdom Government recognise that they have a moral obligation to help the Kurds and not just to leave them to their fate?
Look, of course, the SDF is part of the coalition against Daesh. I admire our Kurdish friends and partners enormously, and our posture hasn't changed at all. What we're talking about here is the possibility of Turkey moving into northwest Syria. We don't know how far that incursion is going to be, and the fact that the US has said that under those circumstances it would withdraw 50, we understand, of its people from the immediate area. So I think we do need a sense of proportion in respect of this, but of course we have to react to circumstances.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
I'm very sorry to disagree with my friend the Minister, but saying, oh, well, it's only a withdrawal of 50 people is like saying, well, it's only the withdrawal of HMS Endurance before the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Isn't it the fact that if the green light is given to Turkey under its Islamist regime to attack our allies, it will be an act of treachery and betrayal not dissimilar to what happened in 1944 when Stalin basically gave the green light to Hitler to crush the Warsaw Uprising.
Minister of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for that. I disagree with his analogies. We can discuss that, I think, at some depth, perhaps more when we have more time, Mr. Speaker. What I would say is that we've been very clear where we are on this. We would oppose any incursion by our good friend and NATO ally Turkey into Syria. He's tempting me to sort of speculate on what we might do in the event that this happens. I think a lot of his remarks are probably addressed at the US, and no doubt the US, who I'm very sure listened very carefully to my right honourable friend, will have heard his remarks.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable member for Bournemouth East and others have quite rightly spoken about getting international cooperation in terms of persuading President Trump of the error of his ways. We have friends in the United States. We know that General Petraeus, and we know that elements of the Republican Party disapprove of Trump's activities. Could we not use a backdoor approach via our friends, parking our tanks in his backyard, if you like, to get the President to change his mind? With an eye on the next election, this might work.
Minister of State.
Well, I'm not quite sure which election the honourable gentleman is referring to. It certainly would not be the UK government's job to interfere in US elections, presidential or otherwise. He's rightly referred to opposition to this particular thing in Washington, and I'm sure, since no doubt his voice is influential on the Hill, that he will be listened to carefully.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the honourable member for Brighton Kemp Town and the member for Reigate and I were on the ground in Syria 3 weeks ago, the Syrian Democratic Forces were very clear of their appreciation for the help of coalition countries, obviously including the UK and the US. Can the Minister confirm that, given the resurgence of ISIS, particularly around Deir ez-Zor, the fact that at night great swathes of north-east Syria are no-go areas for the SDF after nightfall, but we will redouble our efforts in supporting the Syrian Kurds?
Well, we do support SDF. SDF is an important part of the coalition. Clearly, it's absolutely central to it. And as I said in my earlier remarks, the worry is that this recent news, if it's carried forward, will detract attention from Daesh along the Euphrates River. That would be extremely bad for the stability of Syria, and it would be extremely bad for the rest of us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister rightly says he's proud of DFID's support in the region, and he rightly speaks of the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. But that's 20,000 people from Syria over the course of 5 years. We only have 1 year's commitment from the government so far about what's going to happen after the end of that scheme next year. And with 12 million displaced people from the Syrian war so far, and the possibility of refoulement and new refugees from this action ahead of us, will he not now consider asking his government to redouble and increase the numbers of people coming to this country for resettlement? Because why should we not want to be the best country in the world for welcoming refugees and allow them to come through safe and legal routes?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I mean, she says the best. Well, actually, do you know what? I think we probably are. If you look at the sum total of our contribution to this, I think it's extraordinary, actually, and I'm really proud of it. And I'm proud of it on behalf of my constituents and hers, because they're the ones who ultimately provide this. Not the Honourable Lady and not me, it's our constituents. And if she looks at the package objectively, I'm more than happy to sit down and discuss it with her. I think she would share my view that we're doing extremely well in terms of the humanitarian package in Syria, and we will continue to do so.
Rob Seeley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to declare an interest. I've worked alongside the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, and men and women, I consider them very impressive soldiers and incredibly generous hosts. My question to my honourable friend: if this is just about a redeployment of 50 servicemen, is he saying that this crisis is overblown? Because it seems to me, and I'm not trying to trap him into a trick question, if you have the Turkish army and the Syrian Kurds with their extensive border at each other's throats at any point along that border, it is a potentially extraordinarily state of affairs, both for ISIS soldiers, but also for the stability and the humanitarian aspects of this problem.
Yes, I mean, we're obviously responding to events and what we are being told, but the information that's available to us is that this is envisaged as being relatively modest, but I have to say to the honourable gentleman, whose experience in these matters is broad and deep, that he will know the matter is extremely kinetic, and it may very well change. We have to be consistent, however. We oppose any move into Syrian territory by Turkey. That's the wrong thing to do. And really, I think I'd probably leave it at that. But obviously, this matter is evolving, and we're going to have to respond as we find the situation at the time.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, the Turkish president has recently improved his relations with Putin, and the Russians and also the Iranians who are fighting on the side of Assad will also have views and interests on what is happening here. Isn't the danger of what President Trump has done is that he actually reduces the influence of other forces in the region and means that the autocrats and demagogues are dominant in this conflict?
Minister of State.
Well, we want to make sure that autocrats and demagogues are not dominant in this conflict. He talks as if action has been taken. That is, to my understanding, not the case yet. So what we're talking about is what might happen. And what we have done is to say that we do not believe that what has been discussed is the right way forward. We believe that we have to ensure that Turkey doesn't go ahead with this. It will be unhelpful. If they don't go ahead with it, then presumably the US will not carry out the action that has been talked about and which the President has been tweeting about.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only way to stand firm against this recent scourge, that is Daesh, ISIS, call it what you will, is to do that, is to stand firm. And to withdraw now, certainly as a former soldier, seems like an act of betrayal to the Kurds, who are brave allies, who do not want to see on our TV screens fighting for their lives in the days to come. Can the Minister assure me that if there are any British soldiers on the ground, they will not get caught up in the fighting, if indeed there is some, between the Kurds and the Turks?
Yeah, I think I can give that reassurance. As I said in response to an earlier question earlier on, that we don't have boots on the ground. Let me be clear. That means we do not have combat soldiers on the ground, and I'm grateful for the opportunity that he has given me just to clarify that point. We have others as part of the coalition who engage, for example, in training, and across the Middle East we have UK servicemen engaged in the fight against Daesh. That will continue. Our number one imperative is the defeat of Daesh, and I think we have to celebrate the fact that we have been very successful, the coalition against Daesh, in achieving a substantial degradation in that particular malign organisation. That will continue.
For the benefit of those observing our proceedings, I explain that I now call the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, otherwise known as President Moon. Mrs. Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement. It's been very, very clear. But the Minister said that the issue has now moved into diplomatic discussions. It will also be moving this weekend and over the next few days into parliamentary discussions. The NATO Parliament will be meeting here in London, and I can assure the House that parliamentarians across the NATO alliance, and the NATO alliance is not involved in Syria, but allies within the alliance are, will be discussing this, will be talking to the Turkish representatives, will be talking to American representatives who will be at the conference. Across parliaments across the alliance, discussions such as this are taking place, and they are so important to also sending clear, concise messages to the governments who will be making decisions that will impact on all of our countries and our Turkish and our Kurdish communities within them.
State.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. Obviously, she serves great distinction as Chairman of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and no doubt these conversations will be had over the next few days, particularly noting Turkey's status within NATO.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've also had the privilege of seeing the work of the Peshmerga combating Daesh on the front line, this time in northern Iraq, and also the work of the Kurds supporting internally displaced people in the region. Can I have an assurance that, in addition to speaking to officials at the top of the US administration, that our interlocutors will be engaging with officials in Ankara to say that any Turkish incursion into northern Syria is unacceptable?
Mr. State.
Yes, of course. I mean, he'll be aware, because he knows how these things work, that these conversations happen all the time. I think there can be no room for confusion in the minds of our Turkish interlocutors where we stand on this. We clearly have something of a privileged position with our good friends, the Turks, given their status as a firm ally of this country and as a member of NATO.
Kate Sarmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the 50,000 Kurds that live in this country live in my constituency, and they are in a state of absolute anguish about what is about to happen to their families in Rojava. So will the Minister of State agree to meet with Kurdish representatives from my constituency in the next 24 hours so that he can hear what they are going through?
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that. I just think she needs to just help us reassure Kurds in this country about the extent of what is being, as we understand it, proposed. Now, this has been threatened before, so they will, as it were, I suspect, live their lives in a state of constant anxiety, given the very difficult part of the world in which they and their loved ones live. So far as I know, nothing has happened yet, and I don't think we should do anything here that would heighten their anxieties. The information we do have is that Turks' incursion into Syria, if it happens, is going to be modest in scope, and the US response to that is going to be similarly modest. Obviously, we have to watch and await events, but I don't think we should do anything that is going to cause our Kurds resident in the UK over too much anxiety. I think that would be the wrong thing to do, and I would hope she would assist us in making sure that people are given an accurate view of what's going on.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
How many British-born Daesh supporters does the Minister believe remain in Syria?
Mr. State.
I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate.
Luke Pollard.
Mr. Speaker, there are thousands of Kurds in Plymouth who are equally as concerned as we've heard from other members here today. They're concerned also about the role of the UK. Can I ask the Minister specifically, as well as making clear that a Turkish invasion is unacceptable, can the Minister now look into the military hardware that Turkey will be using to ensure that there are no British-built weapons potentially used in any invasion?
Well, thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He will be aware that this particular matter is the subject of a great deal of work in the departments of state that have responsibility for this particular area, and a great deal of heart searching, if I could put it like that, is going on right now to make sure that what we have done in the past is correct and is correct going forward. He will also be aware that the basis for what we do in this space is governed very strictly by the EU consolidated criteria. That has to be the fundamental way in which we deal with these matters, and notwithstanding the recent past in this respect, for which he will be aware a committee of inquiry has been established by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, we are confident that fundamentally our processes are correct and that they comply with the 8 or so articles of the EU consolidated criteria.
Well, Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The clear impression is that our closest ally, the United States, is abandoning an ally in the Kurdish forces to be attacked by another ally from the Turkish forces. Not only is this a strategic error, but also a humanitarian error, but also will send a signal around the world that if you trust the United States or the UK, you may be abandoned. So will he undertake to speak to his opposite number in the United States and impress upon them that not only is this a bad move now, it's also a bad strategic move.
Mr. Stay.
Look, it really isn't for me to be an apologist for the US, but I think he needs to be a little bit careful about conflating the US and the UK in the way that he has. I think that would be unfair. Let's be clear. The focus of what we understand to be happening at the moment is the 110-kilometre stretch of border covered by the previous US-Turkey Security Mechanism Agreement. It is a fairly narrow strip of land. Now, that isn't to justify anything that's been said in recent times, but nevertheless, I hope it is to put it into some sort of perspective. And I think it would be very wrong if we gave any message about the UK, and I can only speak for the UK, abandoning our partners within the coalition. That is clearly not the case. It is definitely not the case, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the battle against Daesh, which is undiminished.
Kevin Brennan.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister is very assiduous and sincere, but does he understand that hearts sink across the House when he uses phrases like any incursion might only be modest in scope? Because essentially we'll be complicit in the US President's decision to stab our Kurdish allies in the back. It's not just a moral betrayal, it's a strategic error to do what the United States is proposing. And don't we need to speak out more strongly at this stage? Otherwise it will look as if we're complicit.
No, the Honourable Gentleman, who I respect very much, it needs to be careful. We are not complicit with any action the US may or may not take. This is a matter for the US. We have made our position absolutely clear. I don't think I could have been more clear, Mr. Speaker, from the dispatch box than I have been. We are shoulder to shoulder with the SDF and our coalition partners in the battle against Daesh, which is undiminished.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. It seems to me that the British government has 2 points of leverage against Turkey. Firstly, the licences of arms exports to Turkey, and secondly, a review of Turkey's NATO membership. If there is a ground offensive against the Kurds in northern Syria, will the British government deploy both avenues?
I don't think I would put it in the terms that the Honourable Gentleman has put it with respect to him. That's not where we are at the moment, and he's inviting me to speculate. Again, he would expect me to resist speculation. Clearly, we keep matters under review, but what he has suggested is a very, very severe penalty to either threaten or to carry out in respect of Turkey. Let's be clear, Turkey is a long-standing and very close ally of this country, and with that comes diplomatic leverage that we can exert, and we will continue to do so with our friends and allies, the Turks. We've made it very clear that we think that any incursion into Syria would be wrong. It'd be wrong in principle, and in practice, I think it would be disastrous in relation to the fight against Daesh.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even a small incursion into this region by Turkey could have a detrimental effect on the Kurdish fighters there, the communities there. What specific recommendations or representations can the Minister make in relation to women? Because Kurdish women in that area have suffered terribly through this war, including sexual violence.
Yes, I mean, there is some sunshine in this terrible situation, and that is the establishment of the Constitutional Committee and the work of the Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen. And I think it's important that when that's set up at the end of this month in Geneva, that there is comprehensive representation on that. Now, clearly, that's an issue in relation to what's happening at the moment in the Idlib governorate and the northwest of the country. But nevertheless, I agree with her in relation to the importance of the involvement of women. My experience is when that happens, better outcomes are procured, and I hope very much that that committee will certainly include proper representation.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now just under 4 years since this House agreed to UK airstrikes in Syria, and it's worth reminding ourselves, first of all, we were assured that that was part of a strategy that was expected to restore civilian transitional government to Syria in about 6 months. The Foreign Secretary who gave that assurance is now Prime Minister, so he's in a position to do something about it. But the success of the airstrikes against an organisation that was accepted to be a grave threat to our lives and to our security. That operation could only succeed because of the involvement of Turkish soldiers on the ground. Those Kurds, Kurdish soldiers on the ground. Those Kurds paid a terrible price. Around 11,000 of them lost their lives. Several times that number were seriously injured. They didn't only die to protect their territory. They died so that British troops did not have to die protecting our way of life. Will the Minister accept that it's the very least we can do in recognition of the debt we owe to the Kurdish soldiers is to give an assurance that we will not stand back and let things happen to them that we could have prevented?
Minister of State.
I think I can give an assurance that the government will do everything it can to resolve the situation. I mean, he would expect me to say that as a minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that I put my faith principally in diplomacy, which is what we're trying to roll out in relation to this situation. It's not pretty, it's messy, it's dirty, it's complicated, and it's sometimes very difficult to plot a sensible way forward, particularly as you're buffeted by events. But we will be quite clear that this is principally a fight against Daesh. It's a fight that we share with our Kurdish friends and allies, and we are shoulder to shoulder with them. We don't let people down, but we are also, I have to say, the victim of perhaps being rather less powerful than once we were, Mr. Speaker, in traditional terms, and we have to be realistic about what we individually can achieve. What is undiminished is our ability very often to exert diplomacy for maximum effect. I like to think we're extremely good at that, and we will deploy it so far as we possibly can in relation to this situation.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, I met with representatives of the Welsh Kurdish community in Newport, who are obviously extremely worried and concerned about this news, like other honourable members' constituents. So can I simply ask the Minister again to give reassurances directly to my constituents that we will do absolutely all we can to influence partners and to protect the Kurdish people against any action by Turkish forces?
Yes, I can give her that assurance. We're doing everything we realistically can to try to bring some equanimity to this situation. That's been our position from the start. But I think we also have to be realistic about what we can individually achieve. We're influential, but we're one of several. We'll continue to work with our friends and partners within the coalition to try to ensure that this goes in an appropriate direction. As I've said on repeated occasions during my remarks, that does not involve an incursion by Turkey into Syria.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I refer the Minister to Early Day Motion 2772, which reflects the strong feelings that have been expressed in this House today and the Kurdish community, many of whom are in Glasgow South West. Can I ask the Minister, obviously that pleas have been made to Turkey, but pleas in the past have been ignored, and I'm thinking particularly in Afrin last year and asking them to reflect on that. And is it not time that the government now immediately suggests to the Trump administration that they must reverse this policy to protect one of the stable regions in Syria?
Well, I think it's important to say, and this is what we understand to be the case, that the US is not agreeing with Turkey by withdrawing from this piece of territory potentially. So it's not endorsing Turkey's action at all. So I hope it will be joining with the UK and the rest of the coalition to impress upon Turkey that this is not the best way forward in our principal aim for Turkey and others, which is to defeat Daesh, which poses a threat to Turkey, it poses a big threat to Syria, it poses a threat to the UK and the US too. I hope very much that Turkey, because its reputation is on the line in this matter, listens to its friends and allies, and desists from this particular course of action. That's the line we have taken, and I'm hopeful we will have some success in getting it to revise its position in this particular matter.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And along with others, I also expressed great concern over the President of the United States of America's decision to remove their troops. No one can ever, indeed should never, betray their allies, the Kurds, who helped cleanse Syria of ISIS fighters. Turkey's history of response, Mr. Speaker, towards the Kurds in the past has been all-out war. So what discussion has the Minister had with Turkey to prevent their aggression and the threat to democracy and freedom in that area? And that will mean potential casualties amongst women, children and the innocents?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I mean, he tempts me to talk about wider issues relating to the Kurds. And he will know that we have in the past and will continue to discuss these matters with our Turkish interlocutors at every level and in support of our Kurdish friends and allies. It's important that the rights of Kurds and all groups and all minorities and all ethnicities are respected. That is contained within international humanitarian law and all the conventions to which Turkey is a co-signatory. So we will use every opportunity to stand up for the rights of Kurds where we see them being abused.